Good afternoon. My name is David Springer, and I am the interim dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at the University of Texas. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our LBJ in the Arena program today, an energy agenda for 2021 and beyond. Thank you for joining us. Energy is perhaps more important today than it has ever been in human history. The University of Texas at Austin has long been renowned for research related to the state's iconic oil and gas industry. And today, university researchers are pioneering innovative ways to produce energy from these traditional sources in an environmentally responsible manner, while also leading groundbreaking research into new technologies that cover the entire spectrum of energy. On our campus and beyond, there is incredible work spanning innovations in smart buildings, grid innovations in electric vehicles, reducing methane emissions in the production of natural gas, renewable energy, and storage technologies, all working toward more sustainable energy use and a better world. The opportunities and challenges in the world of energy are equally big. And we at UT Austin have led the frontiers of energy research, working closely with industry collaborators who have a profound role in the ongoing energy transition. Leading today's conversation on these efforts is my colleague and friend, Dr. Varun Rai, who serves as the LBJ School's Associate Dean for Research and the Director of the UT Energy Institute, who are event partners today along with BP and the LBJ Washington Center. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Varun, and thanks again to everyone for joining us.
Great, thank you so much, David. Hello, everyone. I'm Varun Rai, Director of the UT Energy Institute and Associate Dean for Research at the LBJ School. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to have a great conversation. With us, we have Mary Streett, who serves as BP's Senior Vice President for US Communications and Advocacy for the Americas region. She has been with BP since 2014 and has a range of international experience, has had a very long and distinguished career in the legal profession before she came to BP. So the first half of the conversation, I'll pose a few questions and Mary and I will be in a discussion. And for the second half of the conversation, we'll be joined by Dr. Aldo Flores Quiroga, who is a visiting professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And before that, he has held many very important international positions and has been a policymaker himself. From 2016 to 18, he was the Deputy Secretary for Hydrocarbons in Mexico, and he was responsible in large parts working with over 150 government officials in opening up of the Mexico's hydrocarbon sector. And we also have Professor Josh Busby, who is an associate professor at the LBJ School, joining us. Josh Busby is also a senior scholar at the Strauss Center and a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council for Climate. So it's going to be a great conversation, and thank you again for joining us. Mary, let me begin by welcoming you and thanking BP for partnering with us in having such a timely conversation. We are in the midst of massive changes that are going on here in Texas, in the US, and more broadly, globally in the world of energy. And there are two things, I research in this area, I interact with hundreds of colleagues on campus and internationally. There are two main dimensions here. One is there are still billions of people, actually, about 2 billion people who do not have access to electricity or energy for that matter, or have very poor access. We know that access to basic services that are generated through electricity are very important for growth and well-being in very basic manners. And we are not talking about very luxurious living here. So that's one dimension, right? And large parts of that population is still coming up and will continue to have those needs. At the same time, we know there are consequences of producing and consuming energy the way we have done in this world for the last several decades. And so, I've always thought of this as this, very, very interesting, important, profound dual challenge. So my first question to you, Mary, is if you could take a step back and situate your work, BP's work in the international context, and give us a little background. Where is BP coming into all of this? And obviously you all have been around for as long as the modern energy industry has been around. So ground us a little bit in BP's work, and then we'll go a little bit deeper into more specifics of your strategy.
Thank you. Thank you, Varun. Thank you to the LBJ School and to the University of Texas. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to talk to you all and this esteemed panel and all of the participants. So really looking forward to it. Let me start a little bit by talking about BP broadly and some of the things that we've said in the last year, but really in the last 20 plus years. But as you mentioned, BP's been around for, gosh, over 100 years, 112 years. And what, an exciting time to be in the energy space right now. But let me start with about a year ago, and it's a year ago this Friday, BP announced a new ambition and purpose. And that is our aim to be net zero by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get there. We also said we were going to transform the company from an international oil company to an integrated energy company. And so for us, over the last year, there's been huge changes in the company and the strategy. And since that announcement last February, we've come out with very specific targets on how do you actually get to net zero. I think in the world right now, you hear a lot of companies talking about that. And I think one thing, and we'll probably get into that a little deeper, is, well, okay, but how do you actually do that? 2050 is a long way away. Are these just promises that we're hearing from companies, or, what is your plan? And for BP, we've set out very specific interim targets. By 2030, we said we were going to reduce our overall oil and gas production by 40%. At the same time, we said we were going to increase tenfold our investments in lower carbon energies to $5 billion a year. And just in the last week, we've made some really exciting announcements, partnering with a German company in the UK to develop offshore wind. We also made an announcement late last year, but just finalized that, to get into offshore wind here in the US, off the coast, the East Coast in New York and Massachusetts. So it really is an exciting time. And I've just focused a little bit on the US, but I think one of the big important things is we're hearing about a number of companies talking about 2050, and we've set a real strategy on how we're going to get there.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary, for that. Building off some of the things you said, tell us a little bit about, in more detail, some of the specifics of the net zero, BP's plan for net zero by 2050. What does it entail? How does BP bring in its own operations versus its supply chain and that of its product? Is that all part of your plan, or are you just looking at one piece? Help us understand this distinction.
I think it's interesting to sort of step back and think about green companies, or what people refer to as green companies, like people that are just in solar or just in wind, and then greening or transitioning companies. And we're in the, I would say, greening company category. And what that means is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, we will be, over the next 10 years, reducing our oil and gas production. But at the same time, as in the offshore wind, we've got to start making investments now to get us there. And so we're making these investments. I mentioned offshore wind, also green hydrogen. That's another area. And we're partnering with Ørsted in Germany on a green hydrogen project. So I think when you think about transitioning companies, it's not going to happen overnight, but the investments have to be made now. And you have to, because the investments that companies like BP make are 10, 20, 30-year investments. So to get there by 2050, the investments start now. And that's what we're doing. And then there's obviously a huge policy component to this. And it's not just in the US, but as we think about the new administration at the federal level, the Biden-Harris administration, and some of their goals, how does BP play into that in the US and globally? And a lot of work for us around methane and reducing our methane emissions from our oil and gas productions. And that's I think a big area of focus for the federal government, and it will be for us as well.
Great. And if you could touch, Mary, on, we will have time when we come back in the panel discussion to bring in more about the focus of the Biden-Harris administration. So we'll have more time to explore that. If you could talk about, one of the earlier points around, we think about emissions and goals also in terms of, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and that is and oftentimes, that's how it plays out, how it adds up, company by company, operation by operation, community and statewide. It matters to where we can end up, right? And oftentimes, there is an important distinction to be made, and it can matter, and it does matter, whether the goals and ambitions are part of just one's operations, or does it include the full arc of not just how things are produced, but then also the full arc of the value chain. So is BP looking at just one part, or is part of your 2050 includes everything?
Thank you, Varun. It does include everything. And we do have very specific targets around emissions reductions. And one thing I think that's unique about BP and our strategy is we talk in terms of absolute emission reductions from our own production. And so that may distinguish us in some ways. Others talk about intensity reduction, which is incredibly important as well. But when you think about reducing our production by 40%, that's obviously one way that you reduce emissions. There's also technologies, carbon capture and sequestration. There's methane controls, measurement. First, you need to measure it, then you can control it. So we have very specific targets around getting our own emissions in our own production reduced, both in our direct as well as our indirect emissions, and then reducing the overall intensity of our emissions from all of the products that we ultimately sell. So we'll reduce our scope 3 emissions from the products we actually produce to net zero, but also the intensity of the products we sell. And part of that is because for BP, we have a huge trading operation as well. So some of the products that we're supplying may not be actually products we produce. So our net zero ambition is across the entire value chain.
That's such an important distinction, Mary. And as more and more companies come up with their own plans or evolve their plans, it would be very important to see that progression going from one's own operations all the way to thinking more holistically and throughout the value chain. My next set of questions to you, Mary, involve a little bit of evolution over the last couple of decades of BP within BP itself, right? And around late 90s and early 2000s, BP really anticipated the ongoing change and the need for really integrating and diversifying in terms of fuel sources and technologies. And so that was 20 years ago. And fast forward, we are in this moment. As you reflect back this horizon of 20 years or so, what do you think in this moment are fundamentally different, if anything, compared to 20 years ago?
Thanks, Varun. And it is a great question. BP was one of the earliest in our industry to really call out and recognize climate change as an issue that needed to be addressed. For BP, I think we made early investments 20 plus years ago into renewables. And at the time, there was a lot of discussion around carbon pricing, but we didn't really see the action follow there. I think today is different. I think there is a real demand, consumer-led demand, and corporate-led demand, and I think the world wants to reduce carbon emissions and wants to address climate change, and that's the big difference I see between 20 years ago and today, and we're seeing that especially with the investor community now, and our shareholders. So people, it isn't just coming from, we recognize the science now that investors, consumers, and shareholders are also saying this is important, and they're looking at companies and saying, what is your plan? What are you doing to reduce carbon emissions? What is your long-term plan and your strategy to get there?
Mm-hmm. That's great. And then let me add one more set of folks that are relevant to the conversation. Those are your current or future employees, right? And that will help us pivot into some of our, what it means for our students and their skills and so on. What have you seen on that front in terms of, how you have interacted with your workforce, and also in terms of your recruitment and the interest, for that matter, from the younger generation in addressing these issues?
Sure. Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one that we think about a lot, because our employees really are our most valuable resource. And how do you attract and retain the kind of talent you need to really make this transition that we're talking about? It's an exciting time to be in the energy world and technology. I mean, I think BP's not just an energy company, it's a technology company as well, because technology is really what's going to take us to this 2050 and to net zero. So how do you attract, the kind of talent? And I think as we think about it as BP, it needs to be the kind of place that young people in particular look at and say, this is, look at this net zero ambition. This is the kind of company I want to work for. But really for me, I think I look at it as, boy, this is the challenge of my lifetime, but I'm in my 50s now, but for young people, it's going to really be the challenge for them. And how do we, as a world, as a country, as a society, deal with the very real issues around climate change? And I think BP and companies like BP are places where we're really working on these issues, and they're tough ones, but it's exciting.
No, great. And so let's, something you said, your own trajectory, right? And I mentioned in my remarks how you started in the legal profession, and of course, there are lots of legal aspects in the energy industry, but obviously for you, it has been a very fascinating, non-linear, if I might say, planned progression, phenomenal. So could you share with us, and this is kind of my last major theme I want to explore with you before we head into the panel discussion, is looking to our students and how, in your view and experience, skill building and using their time now, but then also give us the benefit of your own experience and trajectory.
Well, thank you. I think for me, what I would say the advice to young people now is your career is probably not going to be linear. Now, there are many people that work at BP that started their career at BP, including our CEO. It was his first job, and now he's the CEO. But I think for young people today, whether you're an engineer or a lawyer or social scientist or environmental focused, I mean, these are all areas that I think are going to be needed to really tackle tackle the tough issues we've got. And so, look for opportunities, but don't be so. When I started law school, I think I probably thought I was going to go to law school and practice law in my career, and that's what my father did and his father did. And I thought of myself as a lawyer, but opportunities came along, and I stopped and I thought, well, this wasn't my plan, but it seems like a really interesting, exciting opportunity, and I took it. And as I've talked to young people today, that's what I say: look for those unique opportunities, put yourself in a position to take advantage of them, and your career can take many different paths, but it's probably not going to be a linear one.
And within that, Mary, when you made the shift, let's say, and I don't know when exactly you draw, having made that shift. So maybe tell us a little bit, but as you did that, right, what types of experiences and skills, in addition to your professional training, right, did you really find very useful? And I say that in the context of, here at the school, the university, and, this is a broader thing that is happening across the academia, and especially in the world of energy, is we are in the midst of rethinking our curriculum and training. We, as companies in universities, are also seeing a massive tectonic shift in what students are interested in, and also looking forward, right, what types of skills are needed. So as you made the shift, what types of general tool set did you really find very important that helped you?
Well, if I go back to my law school career, I took a pause. And my parents were a little concerned about it. I dropped out of law school after my first year of law school, and I joined a presidential campaign. I joined the Clinton campaign. I'm from Arkansas originally, and when I joined the campaign, I traveled the country. I met people. I talked to people. I did, real local organizing. Worked, and it just gave me a viewpoint that I think was different, but it also forced me to quickly be able to, I think, develop the skill to look at a problem, take in all of the information that I had, and make a decision on it. I mean, sometimes we don't have the benefit of time to really go through and thoroughly research, study, vet, and you've got to be able to take everything in at once and make the best decision you can. And I learned that skill and developed that skill working in politics, and that served me very well. But I later went into government, and I would say that's probably some of the most rewarding experiences that I had early on in my 20s were working in government, in public policy, and it really it's provided a sort of framework and understanding of all the different stakeholders, if you will, in any decision. So we think about energy, it's not just the shareholders of the company, or it's not just people that are consuming your products. What's the impact on the environment? What's the impact on the local community? What's the impact more broadly? And the more you can see, whatever you're doing and listen and understand and the impacts it has, I think that's for any profession, but it's critical. So whether you're in engineering or law or teaching, listening and really trying to deeply understand all the different stakeholders in any sort of public policy decision is really critical.
That's so great to hear, Mary, that your time and experiences in government and public policy, you call those out as having been some of the most rewarding. And this is our students are, many of them have that experience, but many of them at the LBJ School are going to go out after graduation, and that's so it's very reassuring. We always tell them that is the case, and it's also in these times, it is just so important. Right, it provides an absolutely uniquely extraordinary moment to be in public policy, and also very much aligned with the series LBJ in the Arena. The way we think is, ideas are great, but to have an impact, you have to be out there at the local level and above, and be fighting for it, for your ideas to really have an impact. So thank you so much, Mary, for sharing that. And at this point, I would like to invite our other panelists, Josh Busby and Aldo Flores Quiroga. Both of them are Professor Busby and Professor Quiroga are colleagues here at the LBJ School. So thank you so much, Josh and Aldo, for joining us. And before we get into the panel discussion, let me request each of you to briefly introduce yourself again, because many of our audience joined a little bit later. So Josh, you, and then Aldo.
I'm an associate professor, Josh Busby, at the LBJ School, and work on clean energy transitions and climate governance.
And I'm visiting professor at the LBJ School. I work on energy policy and the politics and economics of energy policy implementation.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Let me pose a question to you first, Josh. We have had an administration change just in the last few weeks, and a massive shift in orientation from the last several years. But internationally, a lot of what we are seeing has been in the discussion. As we try to explore some more issues, could you get us grounded a little bit into what are some of the climate and energy priorities of the Biden-Harris administration, and then what to expect in broad terms nationally and in Texas?
Sure. Well, the Biden-Harris administration has made addressing climate change one of the 4 central challenges for its next 4 years. And as part of that, there is a mid-century goal of having clean energy and a 2035 goal of clean electricity, more near-term goals. And that means a host of changes in a variety of different sectors, from transportation, electricity I've already mentioned, addressing oil and gas leakages, on to a variety of other sectors. I think the part of the initial work with the executive orders that have been issued has been to undo some of the previous regulatory changes that were implemented by the Trump administration. So that was sort of job one as they came in at the beginning, and to address other issues like the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So the U.S. is now back in, and as part of this effort to establish leadership both domestically and internationally, the president will be hosting a leaders meeting on Earth Day in April, and trying to move forward this agenda beyond the initial steps that they've done with the executive orders. So the executive orders have addressed everything from the fuel efficiency standards that were weakened by the Trump administration to oil and gas regulations that were weakened. Now they've got to try to figure out, can we get an infrastructure bill through Congress that would complement some of the initial work with some serious money for that clean energy transition that's already started, but needs a lot more impetus behind it. And then there'll be some more difficult regulatory challenges that they may want to pursue through Congress, which I can talk about in a bit.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. Mary, let me pull you into this a little bit. And from BP's perspective, one of the things you mentioned is internally going through a transformation from an international oil and gas company to an international integrated energy company. Now, coming more specifically to the US, and as we see this fast and desire to move deeply along electrification, but then also the full value chain, how is BP shifting its work here in the US, and what are some of the big focus areas? You already gave us some idea around your new investments, but if you tie it a little bit more specifically to the US.
Sure. When we made our announcement last year, we also talked about helping the world get to net zero and to advocating for policies that help the world get to net zero. And so let me just talk about a few of those policies. I mentioned it earlier, but methane and controlling methane and methane regulation. during the last 4 years, the Trump administration had moved to roll back some of the Obama era regulations around methane. And we said, during the last few years, we said we support the federal direct regulation of methane. And that was different than a number of other companies in our industry, but we were really making the business case for that. And I think that's important to remember in all of this as well. We see real opportunity and upside with some of these regulations, and methane leakage is a problem, and it's a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we think if gas is going to be viable, natural gas is going to be viable, you've got to, through this transition, you've got to control for methane. It also, you keep it in the pipes, you sell more gas. So so we have called for a number of years the direct federal regulation of methane. That's something that the Biden administration has called for as well. And so we look forward to working with them to come up with regulation that makes sense. I think there's so many exciting technology advancements around, how do you measure and detect methane and all of that. And we want to make sure there's the regulations that are passed allow for those technologies to really grow and incentivize those new technologies. But so that's an area at the federal level. Carbon pricing is a long time, and economists will all tell you that's the best, cleanest, fastest way to reduce emissions. Politically, there's challenges there, especially at the federal level, but in some states, there's really, that's where a lot of the action is. And so we are working at state level, and some of these carbon pricing programs that are being proposed aren't necessarily economy-wide. On the East Coast right now, there's something called the Transportation Climate Initiative that a number of East Coast states are looking at. We're actively involved in helping to promote that and push that so enough states will pass it. There's also an existing program called RGGI, which deals with the power sector and emission controls there. We're very supportive of that. But I think companies have a real role to play, active role to play in helping make both the business case, but also getting out there and sort of putting their money where their mouth is. We talk about, these big ambitions and goals, and now we've got to show that with our advocacy. So those are two examples at the federal and state level. There's other examples, CCUS legislation in Illinois and in Texas and other places, as well as the West Coast, and continuing to work on carbon pricing on the West Coast. And California's got it. Washington State and Oregon are both actively, this legislative session, especially in Washington State, looking at different options there. And we're trying to be a good partner there and offering, because we've operated in so many different states and around the world, what are the lessons that we've learned and how can we help policymakers as they're trying to balance so many interests. I mentioned earlier we were talking about career, how you have to understand and listen. I was surprised recently. I was talking to folks in Washington State about, they have something called a cap and invest program that the governor is supporting, and they're debating in the legislature right now. And I was listening to the debate, and I was surprised that there were a number of people testifying from different, I would say, environmental justice groups, but coming at it from different points of view, and they weren't supportive of this bill. And I've wrongly assumed, well, carbon pricing is something everybody supports, but I think how that carbon pricing is put into action, and how do you help communities that may be disproportionately impacted by higher gasoline prices, for example, where do the revenues go? And that's something I know the Biden-Harris administration is talking a lot about, but something as a company we're really listening to and trying to better understand what's the role of the corporation in this important environmental justice debate.
Yeah, those are all very excellent points, Mary, and thank you for sharing. And in particular, I'll just remark and then move to open a new frontier of discussion. Is on carbon pricing, there is going to be a lot of discussion, just as you said, Mary, in terms of the heterogeneous effects. It's very efficient, but how it impacts and how and what ability and what mechanisms does one have to really ensure that the impacts are not disproportionate on certain communities and sections of the society. So that's a piece of discussion and issue that will get more and more attention in the coming years. Aldo, let me bring you into the discussion. We have talked about changes to the energy industry, role of technology and policy. Something I mentioned in my opening remarks is, while we are thinking about all of this, there is at least a population of 2 billion in the world, and that includes many countries, both producing nations as well as consuming nations in terms of energy that are part of this, and they have to work through this. Could you help us ground a little bit in terms of what's entailed? And there are two dimensions here, right? And Mexico really is one of those very special places that is both developing and growing, as well as it's a large energy producer, and more on the oil and gas side, although there's a lot of new energy investment that is going on. So what does it look like for a developing country that has a lot of growth to really supply, but then also where its masses really have a very long way to go in terms of their energy experience and services, in terms of enhancing their life? And then that's part A. And part B of the question is, what does it mean for a country that has lots of resources? So let's park that on the table. Let's go to the first question.
Such easy questions you present, give Varun. Let me see if I can frame it from a broader angle. Mexico has made significant progress addressing energy poverty. It's really now a very small population in Mexico that does not have access to modern energy services. The solution has involved naturally some form of distributed energy. But I do want to point out that for many communities, not only in Mexico, I'm thinking of India, for example, as well. The challenge right now is how to move to a cleaner form of energy, as opposed to immediately to a green energy, because the business model has not entirely solved that. So, for example, moving from using wood for cooking or for house warming to using, say, LPG is already an improvement for these families, but it's not necessarily an improvement in terms of where we want to go by. It does reduce emissions, but we would like to get further there, right? So that's one component in which Mexico is combining both renewables and this type of mini transitions, if you will, from one more polluting to a less polluting source of energy. The broader challenge that Mexico is facing is that it's two large national energy companies are trying to find a way to integrate themselves into this new business model for the 21st century. And they are finding a very difficult time with that. So you don't find, for example, the national oil company, Pemex, making the type of announcement that we see BP is making or other companies are making. And we don't find that also from the power company. And that has to do with aspects of ideology, but also with things that I would like to ask Mary if she can elaborate. It has to do with strategy itself. Something was a tipping point or put BP at the tipping point for making these decisions. And it was probably policy, a combination of policy, of science, maybe of the reservations that the asset holders, the stockholders of BP were having, or maybe it was a financial community that was no longer willing to fund projects that were not going net zero. Whatever that was, I venture to bet that it is something that is affecting companies all over the planet, that this is a trend, not just a moment. So if Mary could elaborate on what was the tipping point, it would be very useful. Also for matters of policy making, I'm thinking of two things. One is that when I have spoken to energy company officials, they say, you know, we have many options of things we can do. We just want to know what governments want. And I recall being in a panel with Mr. Looney, the CEO of BP, a couple of years ago. I was very fortunate to be there, and the discussion was precisely on the birth of this new agenda. He was then yet to become the CEO of BP. But European energy policy, the EU's energy policy, was already pressuring in that direction. The US, well, is coming back into this direction. And the question is whether this commitment, which is at least 30-year commitment, 25-year commitment that BP has undertaken or assumed, how does it become sustainable? Is it a matter of policy? What happens if the CEO changes, if the asset owners of the company changes? What happens if technology changes? These things have an impact on the company's bottom line. And so my trick, Varun, was to shift the question from Mexico to BP, as you can see. But I think that there are lessons to learn from that experience. That we can
Thank you, Aldo. Yeah, no, that certainly gives us a glimpse in terms of what's entailed at the highest levels of policy making. But I think thank you for giving Mary another chance here to take us a little bit through the BP journey, which is the exciting part.
Great. Well, thank you, Aldo. And it's a great question. I think I'll go to what's the tipping point? And you mentioned policy. Was it policy? Was it science? Was it investors? Was it financial? I would add one to that, society. And then I would say it's all of the above, because I do think part of this was, Bernard came in as CEO in February, but all of these different groups that you mentioned and society as a whole, and as I talked earlier about what's the difference between 20 years ago beyond petroleum and today, I think the world has changed. And I think society is demanding this. Now, the transition in different parts of the world is going to be on different timelines. I think Europe may be a little bit ahead of the US right now. And, the developing world is probably still in a different place. But I think what society is demanding is action now. And that's really, I think, what the tipping point has been for us. But it's not, as you mentioned, it's not overnight. And that's why this concept of the greening companies and companies that go from what you might call brown to green, how do we make sure those companies are successful? Because that's how we're going to get I would say, the quickest and emissions reductions and meet all of these goals that society has set, whether it's through the Paris Climate Agreement or others, to get to net zero by mid-century. And I think the companies that are transitioning or greening and the success of those companies is going to be critical, because that's how you can really speed up the pace. And you also mentioned, is this sustainable? What if you get a different CEO that doesn't have the same point of view? I don't think this is, again, CEO driven. I think this is societal. I think we see huge opportunities in the transition as well. And also because of the lead times in these projects. I mean, companies like BP are ones that have done complex, big, massive, multi-billion-dollar projects. That's kind of where our expertise is. And that's what you're going to need to really make the transition. And, I don't think it's just, you can go from one CEO to the next and have a different point of view. You got to turn the ship, and we are turning the ship with the investments that you see us making now and the interim targets that we have for 2030. that's going to get us there in 2050. And many other companies, I think over 1,000 companies to date in the U.S. have made their own net zero pledges. So BP is not out there alone. I think our absolute emission reductions, we're a little bit different because we have real concrete targets, but many companies are doing this, and so I don't think it's something that would change with a change in government, for example.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. Josh, bringing you back into the conversation. I know you want to add something. Why don't you do that? I have a similar related question, but go ahead.
Yeah, just on this issue of tipping points. Many of you may have seen the Will Ferrell GE ad for electric vehicles, or the Edward Scissorhands ad during the Super Bowl, and I think that represents a real moment in America in which electric vehicles are going mainstream. And I think we're going to see that the days of the internal combustion engine are numbered. It's not a matter of if, but when. And that's going to pose real challenges for companies. I mean, GM made this decision to make a major turn. They were supporters of the Trump administration's regulatory rollback on fuel efficiency standards, and reverse course and said, we're all in on electric vehicles. And so some companies are starting to make that change. And I think that, the Biden administration coming in is really important for some companies in making that clear decision that, there are market forces that were already pushing in this direction, but now political forces are aligned. And so this is a really important moment in time. And so companies are going to have to transform and become other kinds of companies. But the Biden administration has done some of the initial work with those executive orders, and the harder challenges to come are going to be, can they pass legislation through Congress to send an even clearer signal than they have for whether it be a clean electricity standard by 2035, as some folks hope to do through the reconciliation, or other complementary investments in, say, charging stations all across the country, so that people can actually, have some comfort that if they go driving one of these new vehicles between cities, that they won't get stranded or find that this is just only suitable for in-town driving. So this is, I think, a really fundamental transformation that we really have to take advantage of, because the time is right.
Before I pose my next and final question, Aldo, do you have any additions or reactions to what Mary and Josh said?
Yes, I keep thinking of the cost of policy and the cost of these investments. The example that Josh just gave, which is very important and valuable, to me points to one of the ways out of this conundrum, which is technology. In the absence of technological progress that will bring down the cost of electric cars, or of some other important technologies for the better use of clean energy sources, then the question comes down to prices. And governments all over the planet have an extremely difficult time adjusting prices. If we talk about carbon pricing, we're talking about socializing the cost of energy, basically. If we talk about incorporating many of the new energy sources, they usually mean higher energy costs. We know in electricity that solar and wind are now very cheap, and they are cheaper than traditional fossil fuels. But that still requires more investments and additional infrastructure investments to make that reality be felt to consumers. So the question is, and we cannot answer it, is how long until we get that very competitive alternative transportation. But in the meantime, how tolerant is this society that is yearning for a more clean environment? How willing it is to pay a higher price for this cleaner energy? And I'm not sure the equation is that easy to solve. An example I like to use to give an idea of the magnitude of the challenge is incorporating higher carbon prices in Texas. asks Texans to pay more for their gasoline through taxes or whatever, it's not that easy because there's a whole set of values associated with that pricing. But I mentioned Texas as let's remember what happened with the riots in France and in Ecuador and in Chile and Iran when they were trying their own pricing reform, etc. So everywhere you go, this is a huge challenge. The US, come to think of it, took about 10 years to do pricing reform after the oil shocks and allow the free movement of prices and the like. So what does this mean for companies and consumers is still a big question for policy and I think for company strategy.
Thank you, Aldo. And I think the challenges that you highlighted in terms of dramatically higher infrastructure investment, but then also, the policy and market coordination needed to get there are very real. The flip side of all this is, as we all have explored a little bit in the conversation, is all these different factors pooling into sort of a tipping point, not just for one company, but en masse for the entire industry almost, right? Not anticipating and not working towards to organize and coordinate at different levels could have a starker and harder realization for communities and states moving forward. So, we are in a very, very pivotal moment, I would say. We don't have much time. I would still like to pose a very big question, knowing that there's no hope of addressing it, and in particular to Josh, and we'll see if Mary and Aldo would like to finish up. You do a lot of work, Josh, in India and China. What's your high-level take on, how has China in particular, but then also increasingly India, come around and are seeing this whole transition as an opportunity as well as, challenges in investments and lots of poverty still in different parts of India, but also lots of growth and hope. So how is it all playing out? Such an easy question to address in just 1 minute.
Well, thanks for asking it. It's different in both countries, but both are steadily deploying a considerable amount of renewables, which are now, as Dr. Flores Quiroga noted, are cost competitive with conventional fossil fuels and coal. The challenge is that they're still overwhelmingly dependent upon coal resources, and they have simultaneously built new coal burning power plants alongside deploying a considerable amount of renewables. And so the challenge for both countries going forward is how do you integrate more variable renewable electricity in a power grid. It's not dissimilar to the situation in the US, where except that in India's case in particular, there may be fewer resources to, more stretched resources to be able to invest in transmission, and they still have a considerable portion of the populace that has limited access to reliable electricity services. So there are other drivers like air pollution that have made some of those incentives for making the clean energy transition even more desirable. The challenge for both, though, is how quickly can they diminish the use of coal, and that is a sort of internal struggle in both countries. That is something that I hope the international community can help unlock through incentives and maybe technical assistance, because all of our fates are bound up with whether or not they can succeed in that agenda, because China produces about 27% of global emissions at the moment. The US only about 13, 14%. India is around 7 or 8%. But if they follow China's lead, the global climate problem will be that much worse. So their success will be our collective success.
Great, thank you. And quickly back to you, Mary. I know one of the things you mentioned earlier in terms of BP's strategy is really not having one solution that applies everywhere, rather targeting it and localizing or regionalizing it. Could you remark on that as we close this session off?
Sure. As part of BP's transition from the international oil company to integrated energy company, we put together a new group within BP called Regions, Cities, and Solutions. And it is really an integrator within the company, but that so we can go to cities, countries, companies, and offer them the kind of integrated solution that meets their needs. So it's really just a recognition of, I think, what Josh is saying. Different countries, within India, there's different challenges in different parts of the country, but what can BP, a company that's been involved in really complex, challenging issues for over 100 years, what can we bring to the table? I think some of these technical challenges, technology fixes, but integrating, in our experiences working around the world, what might be right it might be a combination of wind, solar, natural gas, combination of those things. And I mean, just bringing it back to Texas, because it's all about Texas, we just announced, we have our Region, Cities, and Solutions group of BP announced a program with the city of Houston to help them meet their net zero ambitions. And just last week, we announced a deal with Uber, or a partnership with Uber, to work with the city of Houston to help them with the infrastructure, or think through how do we solve the infrastructure problem for electric vehicles. So that kind of very local assistance, bringing parties together to help cities, regions, and companies solve these challenging problems. I think that's what BP can bring to this.
Great. Well, such a great note to end the session. And before I do that, I would like to just thank you everyone for joining. A couple of things to note. We have recorded this session, and we anticipate being able to post this in the coming few days or week. Also, please visit lbj.utexas.edu for other events. We have lots of exciting things that have gone on for the last several months and are in the books for the next few months. I encourage everyone to join Black Studies at UT for a conference that starts just after this event on the state of Black UT. And with that note, I thank Mary, Josh, Aldo, David Springer, and also not in the least, Victoria Yu and Beverly Ume for helping us do this. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.